Great. Welcome, everybody. We see you all trickling in, and we're going to get started in just a minute. We'll let everyone get situated. It's great. Welcome, everybody from across the globe. I'm here in Miami, and we've got Michael and Fleur in the UK. And Martin, where are you?
I'm in London as well.
Oh, you're in London as well. Okay. Great. Well, the numbers are moving up, so we'll give everybody a minute, keep going here, but we want you to know we're here and live. Looking forward to our discussion today. Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started with our intros, and that way we can get into the content as more people are joining us. I'm J.Thelander, the founder and CEO of J.Thelander Consulting, and we are looking forward to our discussion today on global compensation for private companies with a focus on the UK and the US. We're going to be using our Q&A function, so if you have questions, I've got Morgan on my team who's going to monitor that and keep us apprised of these questions. We really want it to be interactive today. We've got a lot of information, but also a great panel. So we're looking for this to be informative and also responsive to what your specific questions are as we hit topics. So and we can want you all to ask your questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fleur and let you introduce yourself, and we'll go from there.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am Fleur Benz. I'm the incentives partner at the London office of the Palo Alto headquartered law firm Wilson Sonsini. I've had many years experience advising tech and high growth VC-backed companies with a particular focus on sort of UK-US cross-border issues, generally helping UK and European companies expand into the US and particularly expand their equity incentive arrangements and navigate the sort of differences between the jurisdictions in relation to both the legal landscape and also market practice when it comes to incentive arrangements.
Great, thank you. Martin, we're going to turn it to you. We'll stick with the Wilson Sonsini team first.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. I'm Martin Luff. I'm an employment partner at Wilson Sonsini, so I advise on hiring, firing, and everything in between. I'm based in London. In the 20-odd years I've been in employment law, about half my career has actually been in the US. So I'm a dual licensed UK-US employment lawyer. I spent a lot of time, like Fleur, working with our UK and EU clients who are looking to expand to the US. But obviously with our firm, we've got a significant roster of US clients that are also looking at the UK and Europe. So we help clients in both directions.
Great, thank you. And Michael, Danforth Advisors, we've had the opportunity to work with you in Boston and now with you in the UK. So fill us in how you fit into this trifecta here.
No problem. Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Cunliffe. I'm Managing Director of the UK for Danforth Advisors. So as a quick background, we help companies, early stage life science companies, help them grow and scale through to public stage across all functions, including HR. So this kind of compensation and stock comp conversation is one we have pretty regularly. And I think that given the transatlantic nature of UK biotech, this is a very relevant topic.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to jump into some data here because I think that's really what everybody is interested in, also to talk about, why we're here today and what we've prepared for you. So overall, we wanted to really be looking at, we've expanded our global reach here at J.Thelander into the UK. We were asked by the BIA organization, and we came and spoke and learned a lot about what you have going on there, and also now have a nice footprint in terms of compensation and the surveys that we run, which are real time. And so we're going to be looking at the compensation for private companies, both in the US and the UK. And then the key considerations around equity awards. As we were prepping for the call, we understand that there are some notable differences in the granting the equity awards, and then the at-will employment and the other components here. So by way of background, I'm J.Thelander. I started the company about 30 years ago in the Bay Area, and we have surveyed exclusively private companies as well as investment firms. And I'm proud to say today that the data is real time. So the surveys are not running annually, they're running 24/7. And we cover both compensation for private companies, salary increases and bonuses, merger and acquisition, carve-out programs, change of control and severance, and then outside board member compensation. So a lot of areas that are very topical for all of you on the call here. By way of background further, the industries are about half life sciences and the other half tech. And as we know today, and I'm sure, Michael, you can attest to this with your clients, that there's a lot of transparency across life sciences and tech, because with AI and robotics and other companies that are sort of tech, they may also be using PhDs and MBAs and doctors who are on their team. So it's not just one size fits all. You got to understand the whole lay of the land with the marketplace. I know we discussed this with the Wilson folks on the total financing raised to date, because not all series of financing is created equal, right? So somebody's Series A could be $50 million versus somebody's Series B could be $50 million. So total financing is really a great way to be looking at all the different compensation components. I don't know, Martin or Fleur, if you have a comment on this.
Martin, I don't know if you.
No, I think what I'm seeing is that seems to be generally reflecting what we're seeing in terms of what's coming across our desks in terms of the types of financing that's going on. Good news, it seems to be picking up, but yeah.
I mean, the later stage financings of this $200 million plus, the IPO markets have been pretty quiet right now. So companies are raising more capital. We were just prepping for a call on the venture side with PitchBook yesterday, and they were saying there still is a lot of dry powder. So the private markets are staying private longer, and there are more financing rounds and people staying. There have been 10 exits this year only. So it's been quieter, and the private companies are keeping their capital, needing to raise more capital, but there hasn't been too much activity to get out.
Yeah, I'd add to that as well, Jody, just from a UK perspective, is that a lot of our earlier stage rounds can be a little bit smaller than some of our US counterparts at times. Although it's not a dramatic difference, it does skew slightly smaller. The other thing I think too is for our in the UK, our larger rounds often call it a Series B and beyond. At that point, a lot of our UK companies are really kind of becoming international and have US operations or are about to pull the trigger on them.
Yeah, so the total financing is really relevant because that dollar amount really helps. Well, we're going to look in here versus most recent series of financing. We like the dollar amount because those differences do really impact the cash and equity mix. By way of titles, the titles in green are included on what we call our silver subscription, which is the no charge subscription. So I am going to put a little plug in here, and Morgan is going to put, my team is going to put a link in for the survey, because if you participate, we have that give to get model. So if you give your data, you get all these job titles in green on the platform for no charge, which can be enough for you to be dangerous and look at some compensation and get a handle on the mix between cash and equity. But what we value ourselves on here is that we cover not only the chief and VP titles, but also get all the way through down director and the admin titles and all of the science and clinical, regulatory, engineering, because that's the crux of many of these private companies are not only the chief and VP roles, but there's a lot of critical key employees that are at the mid-level and junior. So we really encourage participation, especially those of you that are here globally, because that's helps us really be able to give you access to be able to compare and contrast across the globe with the US and the different areas. So the other thing that we have to offer is the monthly newsletter, which has really grown in size because this data is only as good as you know what to do with it, right? We want you to be able to understand how the data really impacts your organizations, looking at the differences between the US and UK. That was our July newsletter. Sort of what is venture debt, the salary increases, how those are impacted by total financing. So that's part of what we're here to talk about today, is the relationship between the data and the reality in the marketplace about how it translates. Let's talk about the different compensation levers for private companies. And Martin, maybe you having your compensation expertise as well can help us on sort of what the UK components of this are as well. So we look on the cash compensation side of base salary, sort of explains what that is by name alone, right? And then current bonus, we consider to be a bonus that was rewarded versus a target bonus, which is a bonus that's out on the horizon. And this all sort of goes into the total cash compensation, which can be a combination of base and bonus, or many companies just have a total cash coming from their base salary. Michael, what do you see in the companies that you're working with in the UK specifically? A lot of bonus programs for young companies, or they tend to stay away from that?
Yeah, we do see some bonuses, but I generally don't think they're as high as they are in the US. I think US bonus culture is a little bit more. I think we often kind of see more bonuses towards the executive level with specific objectives. I think bonuses kind of at the non-executive level are just a little bit lower. But yeah,
That's tricky.
Yeah. I would agree with that, Michael, as well, in terms of what I'm seeing in drafting employment agreements is that the bonuses tend to be pretty light a lot of the time. Discretionary bonuses, there's not a lot to it. Boards of directors are wanting to keep a lot of discretion in terms of figuring out how and when. But occasionally you will get some pretty detailed plans that are tied to specific objectives, but those are rarer.
I think that's a really important point to make. I took the screen down so that we can discuss this for a second. Bonuses are really tricky because it's very hard to monitor those and to put in place the formal structure, and then people are concerned about if they're going to get it. So we've heard more and more from VCs as well that they really want bonuses just to be discretionary and to do the more spot awards versus being planned ahead of time.
Yeah. Yeah, and then also where we see pushback as well sometimes is a desire to preserve cash in the business. And certainly where you've got founders in early stages, then obviously they have equity. I mean, as the business grows, then they are long-term incentives through the growth of their equity. The idea of having substantial cash bonuses is an early stage can, there's friction with wanting to grow the business.
Yeah. I'm going to share the screen back. We have the different buckets here of equity. So that's exactly really, I mean, the equity is the long-term incentive, and it's much easier just to have your total cash come from base pay and then the different buckets of equity. So when we survey, we look at founder shares. And Fleur, I mean, I would love your thoughts on this, whether there is an actual definition of a founder, or this is just the person who started the company and this is an early bucket that gets, accounted for equity.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on what Martin said as well, I think the importance of equity is that alignment with investors as well as the growth of the company, and which is why there is that focus, particularly for founders, on equity versus cash bonuses. So just wanted to sort of add to what Martin said on that. There's no sort of legal definition of a founder, but yeah, I think you're right. It's those early people who are brought in, either set up the company or brought in very early as a co-founder. I think what's important to realize about sort of founder shares and any top-ups for founders that you might go through on each round is that they're very likely, and particularly in the UK, to be subject to vesting, whether that's over, and sometimes you have investors come in and apply vesting to the shares that founders already own, and the sort of hotly negotiated in the UK, particularly sort of lever provisions relating to those founder shares. So that is something that, founders are very focused on as part of an investment round. But it comes back to that whole investors wanting founders aligned with their interests. They want to keep these founders on side, on board, and working to that ultimate exit.
That's a great point. And that, the founder shares, and then the other buckets that we show here are the additional equity that founder gets past getting their founder shares for their current jobs. Let's say a founder CEO, and then they they're fully vested, or they're getting partially vested, and they need an additional equity grant. That falls into a different bucket than a non-founder CEO, right? Somebody who comes in from outside. But really, and let's get into a little bit of this data, but the vesting is important, and it's also all predicated on, right, if the founder gets a lot of equity and they get diluted down as they go through their financing, then maybe their additional equity past their founder shares isn't as much. So it's all these numbers are predicated on the fact that you've got to get it right from the beginning. And Michael, I see you shaking your head. So
Yeah,
you obviously see this in effect.
Yeah, I was going to add too. I think to add to the mix, what we see in the UK too, sometimes there's a little bit of push and pull around what is the definition of a founder, because I think quite often we see what I'm going to make up some terms, but there's a lot of academic founders who are spun out of a university who perhaps are first-time CEOs versus more kind of experienced CEOs, experienced kind of commercial founders. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of movement in the number depending on expectations of how long that founder is going to be in the CEO chair and run the business, but also their experience. So I think sometimes there's a little bit of movement there.
I mean, the biggest mistake we see when we're doing compensation consulting is that the founders, especially of a life science company, have been very altruistic, very genuine in their focus on the science and not as focused on their compensation. And that's where the problems issue, because they're not really where they should be with market. Now they're hiring other people who are sophisticated, and all of a sudden there's a call to action because there's a gap between where they should have been and where the other people who are coming in, and there's an imbalance.
Yeah,
and Martin, I see you shaking. Yeah,
challenging to fit retrospectively as well. So often, kind of once you move through that initial phase, it's hard to fix it.
Yeah, we had a question come in asking how do we define a co-founder? And I mean, Fleur, maybe this is one to send to you, but when we look at we let companies tell us who a founder is and if they got founder shares. And there may be, our data shows I'm going to move this into I knew that we were going to be jumping around, which is why we keep this deck down so you don't have type of whiplash. But if we look at the option pool, here we go, then maybe you can speak to this a little bit. Right, so the definitions, the founders bucket here, Fleur, could be many founders, right?
Yeah, and I think, we often get, the company might have been operating for a while and actually they want to bring on someone that they call a co-founder. And I think it's that someone that they see as very key to the establishment of the company. They might have been an advisor, they might have been sort of helping, but not having shares in the company at that point, and then actually coming on in slight, not on incorporation, but a little bit later to really sort of play that founder role and be very involved from that startup. So, and I agree with you, we let our clients tell us who they think their co-founders are. It's not for us to put the label on someone, and it's really that, how crucial they are to that business from that early stage and growing that business.
Right, so we surveyed this.
So that becomes, as you're negotiating with your investors as to, how much equity they get or whether they get a top up, you're convincing your investors that these are taking a founder role, basically. So.
Yeah. And if I could add to that, we've seen cases here where, often you have a couple of academic founders who've worked in super close collaboration, developing the science that comes out, and they want to be fair to each other, even though they're in like a CEO, CSO type role. And so often the benchmarking data doesn't reflect, and so you sort of have to have a conversation about, okay, well, as a pool, or how do we approach it as a group? It's up, if you want to do it a slightly different way, that's fine. But collectively, the number needs to look like this.
Right. Well, we're getting a lot of questions on this, so I'm going to dive into it because the questions are great, talking about, they're obviously, especially in the UK with these large academic organizations, really the same thing in the Bay Area. There's quite a bit of academic environment and companies are coming out of labs, as well as in Boston and even in New York. But obviously these areas where there are labs and high level of universities. So let's talk about this. So what we've done here in terms of the survey data is to look the optimal. So the reason why the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile for the founders buckets are different and obviously have a range depends on how many founders there are. So, and also depends on what type of company. And then the employee pool, this is the piece that's important to note, is running in that 10 to 15%. board members is outside board members, right? These are people who are not investing. And then the investors are here showing the percentage they have. And then I'm going to jump from the biotech to the seed stage and go through this. So the seed stage, you can see, this is under $5 million in total amount of financing raised. This is showing that the founders obviously have a large amount of the company, and it depends, these percentages are based, again, depending on how many founders there are. The employee pool, and this is what we discussed yesterday, you know, Fleur and Martin were discussing that they see mostly with their clients in that 10 to 15%. So that's what it shows. And the investors obviously don't own as much. Now you're getting into an early stage company. The capital raised has gone to $5 to $15 million. So now there's dilution. And the founders are diluted down. The employee pool, that what is important to understand here, stays the same. We're at about that 10 to 15%. Now the investors own more of the company. A late stage company, so we jump from the 5 to 15 million to 90 million plus, because you can see that there's a natural progression. So now the founders have been diluted down further. The employee pool staying consistent, 10 to 15%, and the investors own, you know, somewhere closer to that 80% on average of the company. And then this is the piece for us to talk about, is what happens in that 10 to 15% and what happens to those founders, because we had a question come in that was right on the mark about this, talking about if you have an academic or somebody who has, you know, started the company and then there's another technology or IP that gets patented, what happens to those founders or those academics if the company is successful and that academic moves forward? Then they move, and maybe Fleur and Martin, you can discuss this, they move into some of these percentages, like they need to get additional equity, and they need a refresh grant. And that could be part of that employee pool of 10 to 15%. It's really predicated on how good of a job they were given their equity, and they've gone through this dilution in the first place. So maybe you could break this down for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think an investors is coming on. The dilution is obviously, you know, something that they're very aware of. They're obviously aware of their own dilution, but they need to keep these founders on board, and so top-up grants will occur. But, you know, within that sort of view of overall dilution for the investors, and which is why you don't see that employee pool really go above that 15%. You know, I think, and it was quite interesting seeing your graphs there, that you see the early stage, there's much more around that sort of lower level, and then as you get to subsequent funding rounds, actually you see that pool, it does increase a little bit towards the higher end, but really never going to that 15%. And that is really, you know, that increase in the pool is really to ensure that as the company grows, it's still got enough headroom to keep those key people on board as your subsequent funding rounds. So
yeah, because the question came in about, you know, are there the resources to get this right in the beginning? And that's a great question, because it's so important to get this right in the beginning. So the sooner you set compensation appropriately, and Michael, I know you see this with your companies, the less catch up you have to do, because if you make mistakes in the beginning, then you're going to have to fix those somewhere along the way.
Correct. And I think sometimes it can be hard to fix these things. So I think, you know, no one has a perfect crystal ball. You know, one thing we know is plans change all the time. But I think as a starting point is really having to think about what your future organization is going to look like in terms of leveling roles, etc., and working through that pool. I think that the thing that I often see people not understand is that you'll have an initial pool, call it from Series A or your first round of investors. If you like to top up that pool, that needs to come to the expense of someone else in the form of dilution. And so, you know, someone has to pay for that, and someone does, and it's the later round VCs. So you should expect that to be a fairly aggressive conversation, because the VC is going to pay for it. And so it's not an easy conversation. So I think keeping some buffer, keeping some overhang is really important. Yeah, because, you know, you're going to need it.
Yeah, I mean, Martin, you see this, I'm sure, from the employment agreements and other things going on. The earlier you set infrastructure in place and have a plan, have a comp philosophy, have a plan, have the right employment agreements that talk about the liquidation preferences and the stack, and knowing the compensation, the better off these companies are in terms of stability and the less friction you have down the line with the board.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's always going to be friction, right? Because expectations change over time, and we often see that founders, um, this is their baby. They come in extremely unsophisticated. They have to, they understand there's the quid pro quo. If you're going to take other people's money, they want something in return for that, so they give up, percentages. They give up control. You can't always, as you said, you can't predict what's going to happen. There's no crystal ball for this kind of thing, but trying to avoid as much friction as possible is ideal, because you want everybody to be aligned, particularly the founders focused on having the business succeed rather than watching their own back. So the more we can help clients do that, the better.
And also we have data. I mean, we're here on this call. Let's make no mistake, right? The J.Thelander data is great with this. I'm going to show you a little bit here around this is the CEO global compensation. United States biotech hubs versus the UK. So we're looking at the UK, Boston, Northern California, Southern California. And this is total cash and total founder equity. This is across all financing levels, but it's just to give you an idea, right? And the point that we're trying to make here, and we discussed this earlier, is that these top jobs, these CEO roles and these founders are very expensive no matter where they are. Look how comparable the compensation is, right? The median and 75th, where you see the drop. And then here is the total cash US. This shows you also the 25th median and 75th percentile. And you can see that the compensation for CEO is very competitive. And I don't know if this is a surprise to anybody on the call, but it's sort of good news. The next part of this is looking at the total founder equity, the UK versus Boston, Northern California, and then Southern California. And you can see things very credible and very consistent. So it's not rocket science. There's great data on this. And you can also then look at this further by the total financing. And as we saw before, that there's obviously at the earlier stage of financing, your cash is lower and your equity is higher. And the better job you do of setting that in motion right away is great, because you're going to get diluted, and then there may need to be top ups. But if you're not far off the market to begin with, you have a better chance of not having issue. And then when you look at the scientific director, right? So this is a different job, the US versus Boston. This is where you start to see the differences. So maybe, Michael, you want to talk a little bit about this, because I know I'm talking really fast. So the top job is to recap, and the top job doesn't matter where you are, that CEO job. But when you get into some of the other levels, and that it does change, and it is less expensive outside of the US. So let's talk a little bit about this and slow it down.
Yeah, so maybe if I start with the executive level first. So kind of at that CEO, C-suite level, that comparability doesn't surprise me at all, because what we often see is investors making a choice about, in a UK company, they may bring in a US CEO to run a high potential UK company, and therefore at that CEO level, people are comparable. They're great people. They're good at what they do, and so and it's competitive. So the compensation feels about right. Where it doesn't surprise me is as we start to move further down the chain, and I think kind of at that senior management level, there's that differential. We don't have the depth necessarily yet of the serial entrepreneurs and the repeats, so that there is a bit of a differential there. I also think it's a function of the US biotech market is much more competitive and fights for talent harder, and it's a function of its success. So I think we will get there as well.
And across all levels. It's competitive. And also how we looked, and Martin, I know I'd love your thought on this, because I saw you shake your head earlier, across the different industries, right? It's so competitive because the tech and the life sciences in some cases are competing for the same talent, much more so in the US than the UK.
Yeah, I think it is obviously, competition is what's driving these numbers. But that was really interesting, the charts you were bringing up, and particularly as you move down the level of seniority, that you're really seeing that gap open up. And it's a conversation I have with my clients a lot of the time when they're making hires in the US. So if you have the senior executive and the founders in the UK and they're making their initial hires in the US, all of a sudden they may find that their US employees are highest paid in terms of cash compensation in the company. And they get over that shock and realize that's simply what the market demands. And obviously having data like this is incredibly helpful because it reassures them that this isn't some sort of glitch, that it is in fact more expensive. And it's also helpful to me to remind them that given that dynamic, there are other parts of the overall package that there's reasons why you stay market. And just as an example, a little bit tangential, but like vacation allowances, you get UK clients that say, well, we want to give them 35 days of vacation a year. And I just say, well, hang on a second, that's not market in the US. They're already getting cash significantly higher. And if you're giving them all those same benefits, you're suddenly getting this very skewed packages across jurisdictions. Like they can't all be the same. They have to be jurisdiction aligned with market practice. But it's that level of sophistication, understanding the markets, having this data to hand that allows them then to see why you treat each jurisdiction in its own right.
Yeah, and Fleur, we had a question come in, and if we could talk about this, because I know we did talk about it. I'm going to pull this slide up, but the one of the questions came in around percentages of fully diluted shares versus an absolute number. And funny enough, you and I were just discussing this as we were prepping for the call, because what we see in the US is that it is absolutely a percentage of fully diluted shares, because you've got to understand what that percentage is. So I'm just showing you this slide here, for example, of total founder equity. And again, this is across all financing levels, and we can get more granular into this, but so these are percentages of fully diluted shares, 25th median and 75th percentile. And really, that from our vantage point, that's the only way, but maybe explain obviously what happens with evaluation and how that factors in how you can look at a number of shares. If you don't know a number, a number of what, based on, it doesn't really help you.
Yeah, so I think, and this is, ties back into how we talked about how your option pool remains the same at around about that 10% mark. But that is based on your fully diluted share capital. So there is actually a number at each funding round. You know what your fully diluted share capital is. So that is a number. So you might see in the sort of subscription agreements, your investment documents, a hardwired number, but that generally represents your 10% pool, let's say. And then when you come to your next funding round, you calculate what your 10% pool of your new fully diluted share capital is.
Right. So there's a question that came on this about what you're talking about. Basically, that even you need to keep that number at that 10 to 15%. So even if you're a later stage startup and you've already topped up that equity pool, you gotta then it starts to get trickier.
Yeah. The percentage stays the same, let's say 10%, but the actual number of shares underlying that percentage increases as your fully diluted share capital increases, as you get more investment in and more shares are issued to investors. So that's how your sort of pool works. But you're not stuck to the sort of first number of shares that you are at your Series Seed when you're at your later stage rounds.
Right. So this is
kind of just add that just quickly on that. I would just say a lot of this comes down to the VC and investor dynamic. So it's not automatic. You'll get an automatic top up. It's a negotiation between the VCs. There can be push and pull. I think there's an expectation that you will get more each round to redistribute. I think that's generally acknowledged, but who pays for that and how that gets agreed is not always like a smooth straight line. So I think sometimes it's better to be conservative with your allocations, fall back on the data, and there is a tendency to be over generous in the early stage. I think trust the data.
Yeah, well, let's look at some other data, because I think this is really relevant here. One thing I can attest to, because we do quite a bit of year-over-year analysis, and since we've been doing this almost 30 years, we've got a lot of year-over-year analysis. And it used to just be that the life sciences, biotech, medical device was so stable, but now even tech is stable, because tech is taking a long time to have liquidity. That these go.com days are long past, and the private markets on all industries are staying private longer. So if you look here by the CEO median, this is global data. Biotech by total financing. So the total cash number, again, this line is what we agreed earlier that we're going to rely on, because the base pay and the bonus is not a straight addition, because not every company has this is actual bonus. So because the sample sizes are different for the base pay and the bonus, the total cash in many cases is coming just from the base pay. And I know I can say that, but when you look at this, that's the first thing that comes to mind is, why aren't the two numbers a straight addition? And that's why. So the total cash, you can see, consistently goes up with more total financing. And I tell you without any shadow of a doubt, that's always the case. More money, then there's more total cash. And the equity is diluted, right? So let's go down to the non-founder equity. So this is the CEO who comes from outside, may start at an earlier stage company at the higher equity percentage, and then they go down and it stays pretty stable. I mean, Martin, you're doing a lot of comp work and executive, pay and putting together their, legalese around all this. For some reason, I'm at a loss for the words, but I mean, you're seeing that this is pretty stable. It doesn't mean that everyone is using these numbers, but it's telling you, as you're putting together somebody's employment agreement, that's the word I was looking for, that it's not hard to figure out what's going on in the market. Now, you may have a high roller who says, listen, I don't care that the market's 5% steady. I want 8%. And that happens. But overall, the use of data helps give you a sense of what is going on in market. And this shows you that it's pretty darn consistent, right?
Right. I would absolutely agree with that. Certainly from my perspective, I obviously tending to look more at the cash compensation in terms of the employment agreements that I'm drafting. Fleur and her New York colleagues are looking on the equity side, but certainly these sorts of numbers align with generally what I'm seeing. And again, entering a new market when you're a UK or EU client moving to the US, the data is going to be pretty key, because they're only going to be speaking to one or two executives who are going to be telling them what kind of, obviously, they're telling them what's in their own interests, but it's helpful to be able to provide some guidance.
Yeah. And then here, Fleur, I'm sure you can speak to this as well. The 75th percentiles, these numbers are real numbers, right? So the total cash is up to $600,000 as you get to later stage. But the part that I find so interesting is to look at this equity, right? The 75th percentile for non-founder started at the 9.25, but these numbers around the 5% are so consistent.
Yeah, and again, I mean, the figures speak for themselves, and that is probably market. And I think your headroom of your option pool comes under pressure the later stage company that you are, and so a lot of companies, as they expand and bringing people on, really struggle with that, managing that headroom, because you're not going to be able to grant much above that 10%, 15% option pool.
Right.
So there is that careful management, and that's why you don't see that equity growing, because you need equity to bring other people onto your organization as you get to be a later stage company and you start preparing for IPO, for example, or an exit. You need those key people on, you need more of them, and therefore your headroom's under more pressure.
Right, because you're not going to have equity for everybody. And especially now we're seeing some of these issues with a stock underwater. So you've got to go ahead and give additional equity. It's got to come from somewhere. That option pool is only going to go so far. So it's not going to be everybody. Michael, you were going to contribute.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that also too, as you get closer to that IPO transaction, you are getting closer to transparency. And so some of, these people will be disclosed in an S1, F1 document, and you will be able to see the number of share options they have. So I'm also not surprised it does start to normalize out a little bit, because you could be seen to be over or under compensating. So yeah.
Well, I'm going to share this as well, which I think you'll find to be very interesting, because there used to be much bigger gaps. So this is tech, right? So I showed you biotech first. So the tech, no question, the total cash is less. but the equity is remarkably the same around that 5%. The cash is lower, and because what we see, especially in the US, and I'm sure the same in the UK, is that for a biotech CEO to become a biotech CEO, they are typically very well educated. They are very well credentialed. Some combination of an MD, PhD, even an MBA could be in there. And that level of education, training, having coming out of a lab, raise capital, even harder today than ever, taking longer. Good companies are still getting money, but it's taking a long time. Obviously, there's a premium for that, and that's why the cash is higher. But the equity has gotten to be very consistent across all industries. We had a question come in which really talks about something that we discussed in the beginning, but it just shows you how much it's on everybody's mind around a founder and their shares and getting diluted. Obviously, the more you plan for that, the better off you are, because if you as a founder get the right amount in the beginning and you get diluted, then it's not going to be as much friction with the board to ask to require more equity for, as a founder, past your founder shares. But maybe Fleur and Martin, you can discuss this in a more of a breakdown way about what do you advise if you're dealing with a founder CEO coming out of in a life science company in particular, and they've gotten diluted and they need to get additional equity or options, to optimize to make sure they're competitive as the CEO. We don't see differences on cash, by the way, for founders versus an outside, a non-founder, but we do see it with the equity. So how do you help them in an employment agreement or planning for that dilution?
We see obviously top-up grants that are negotiated as part of new rounds, and that is clearly a focus for the founders as to making sure that their equity levels are maintained. We sometimes see sort of top-up grants linked to performance, actually. So, they'll get granted something when they've met certain targets, annual revenue, that sort of thing. So, it does vary, and it all just comes down to negotiation. And also, tying up a few things that sort of Michael said about, who takes that dilution as part of that negotiation. Is it pre-round dilution, in which case it's
right,
the existing shareholders that are diluted? Is it post-round dilution, in which case the new investor is diluted along with everyone else? Is it a mix of that? It's all part of the term sheet and your negotiation, that where that equity settles, and how key those founders are to continue growing the company.
Exactly. It's an easy time to send the message, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to pull this up. Martin, maybe you can speak to this for us. Let's get into the slides specifically on equity grants and types of equity awards.
Yeah, I'll actually sort of bounce this back to Fleur if she's got any thoughts for it as the equity expert.
Okay, well, explain to us the difference, because obviously the type of equity, you don't see, RSUs or restricted stock given very much for private companies, but maybe you want to talk us through this at a very basic level.
Yeah, and I think, and again, that ties into my last point as well, and that as well as sort of looking at the numbers as to, well, how many shares have I got, what percentage of equity I've got, it's like, have I got a tax efficient form of equity? And this is the sort of, what this chart is showing is that sort of US provision where you've got tax efficient incentive stock options, which if you meet certain criteria, give you capital gains tax treatment, versus your non-qualified stock options. And as you say, you've got restricted stock options, which tend to be much more for later stage companies, perhaps in sort of the 12 to 6 months prior to IPO. Restricted stock awards are sometimes used, but really, as we can see from this chart, most companies are granting incentive stock options in order to give people the ability to have tax efficient.
And this is the same, I'm hearing from you, in the US versus the UK, or really the whole of Europe.
The whole of Europe is a little bit sweeping, but definitely in the UK, we have a very similar system, in that we have EMI, enterprise management incentive options, which delivers capital gains tax treatment in relation to option gains versus non-qualified options where you're looking at income tax. So I spend a lot of my time advising clients on how the best way to structure equity incentives in order to give that beneficial tax treatment. And coming back again to something that Michael said earlier about, you know, you need to get these things right in respect of your sort of founder shares as early on as possible when your value is low, so that you can get much beneficial tax treatment as you can. And it's very hard once you have value in your equity to avoid getting an income tax charge on, well, it's impossible to avoid getting an income tax charge on that value. All you can do is defer it to a later date. But once you give value to a founder in a company that they are an employee director of, they're going to be charged with income tax on it. So it is really, you know, part of that. Let's think about how we're going to get these shares into people's hands. It's really, you know, let's think about it up front as soon as we can.
Right. And here is a little bit more detail on this, right, to get it earlier on, which is why the equity percentages are higher in the beginning with the lower financing categories, because the valuation is lower. But it also reverts back to that original question that one of our the people in the audience had asking about, is it a percentage or a straight up number? And it absolutely needs to be a percentage. And that is important that you understand it, because you have to know what the denominator is. And let's talk a little bit about vesting, because we discussed this, and both Michael and Martin said that there have been other types of awards that are performance-based vesting or a combination of time and performance. And that's what we're seeing with some additional equity grants. So time-based is sort of the typical stamp for your vesting, 1-year cliff for the initial grants. But then for follow-on grants, which are all predicated on the amount, right? Did you get the amount right to begin with? Can either be a combination of time or performance. So Michael, you want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing here with your clients at Danforth on this?
Yeah, so we see, you know, we see a number of approaches to this quite often, and often what we see, especially in earlier companies, is over-engineering of performance criteria. And you know, it's well intended, but often actually it's better just not to do it. You know, what they're trying to achieve with performance criteria is noble and great, but actually perhaps it's not suited for an employee stock option plan, which is highly contractual, difficult to change, and can trigger some pretty unfun accounting consequences as well. So generally what we sort of recommend is, unless there's an absolute reason, try and keep, you know, your stock comp as time-based vesting as plain as possible, and look to put your performance criteria kind of elsewhere where you've got more flexibility. So I generally, to answer your question, I think I see performance criteria really only at the super executive level, like that CEO position.
Yeah. And we did have a question, Fleur, before we move on from this, talking about the 409A valuation and the discounts. And I know that there are early stage companies where they do the 409A valuation, and obviously they don't know if there's going to be major runway yet. So there is somewhat of a discount on the value of the common shares. And so even with that, they don't really see restricted stock used very much, but more so on the incentive stock options.
Yes, I mean, one of the key points of, you know, and I talk to my clients all the time, key differences between sort of operating an incentive plan in the UK or Europe and then extending into the US is the whole 409A valuation issue and the deferred compensation regime that operates in the US, and the importance of getting within your 409A safe harbor. And for people who don't know what 409A is or anything, it's, you know, in the US, you have to grant a fair market value, and there are sort of punitive tax penalties that apply if you grant a discounted stock option. So, you know, in the US, you get a 409A valuation report, which is the valuation for your shares, which lasts for a year, subject to any intervening sort of funding round or event that would change the value of your shares. But and that's a very key focus, that you're granting at market value. Obviously, then, what are the discounts to your latest round price that you would argue would apply to your 4098? I'm not a valuer.
Right.
I think sort of 40 to 60% sort of discounts are sometimes, something that is a ballpark as to that latest, discounts to the round. But again, yeah, it's part of doing business in the US. Part of granting equity in the US is making sure you comply with 409A.
Yeah,
I'll put in a plug. Our next newsletter is going to be on valuations, and we really like the company Scalar, and they're doing a new guest appearance on our newsletter to talk about this. So all of you on the call will definitely get that. Michael, you want to go ahead and for a sec?
Yeah, I was going to add this discount, if we're sort of referring to like the discount for lack of marketability, is often kind of the discount we're talking about here. It's very much facts and circumstances. So it's one of those ones where it depends on the share class structure, it depends on the rights between the classes. It is lean on a value, absolutely go and get a third party, really great third party valuation firm, because you will not just defend it with the IRS, you'll be defending it with your auditors. Like, get help on this topic. It's an important.
Yeah, you've got to do this.
Yeah.
We had a question come in at this. I think it's a good way to wind up as we're in our last 10 minutes here, more on the global footprint side. The job market in the US is interesting. We put together this slide for the press recently on the primary locations, companies within the US with the top 10% of total cash by city and metro area. And we still see that the Bay Area is very high, and that is definitely because of the life science sector. And then you do have the other places as well, but it's the Bay Area and Boston. So as many of you on this call are running companies that have a footprint in multiple locations, I think it is important and very relevant to what we discussed in the beginning, that there is definitely a premium for the jobs that are below the CEO in areas like Boston and the Bay Area. So if you're going to have companies that have multiple offices, that's very much important to understand and appreciate. And I'm going to touch on one last thing for us here about the refresh options. And also, I think we talked about the accelerated vesting was something that came up in the beginning. So in terms of the refreshing of options, the number one way that people talk about is, let's see, I'm going to show this slide. We can hit on this real quick just so we hit these last few topics. If you do you have an evergreen program to grant follow-on refresh options? Because obviously the people are in private companies because options are the name of the game. And then it's not only about and you got to also understand the preference, the liquidation preference, the stack, like where are you in it? Because you got to make sure that you know where you are, because it doesn't matter what percentage you have. If by the time they get to you, there's nothing left, then it's not going to help you. So it's very important. And Martin, I'm sure you see this when you're doing employment agreements, right? You got to know where people stand in the order.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. These things come up pretty frequently with our clients, and it's definitely, you can't fix all of this stuff with cash. And so thinking these through, that's obviously where I work with Fleur and her team to make sure that we address these issues.
Yeah. So the evergreen program, people do refresh, and it is as needed or annually or after a financing. But the main takeaway here is that you want to get the equity right in the beginning, because it's likely that as you go through more rounds of financing, you're going to get diluted. And the better situated you are in working with your board and planning and prepping the whole way through, you're going to have less friction, because as Michael said, the equity that you are going to continue to need is going to have to come from somewhere. So keeping that pool and not letting it dip below that 10 to 15% is very important. Fleur, do you have anything to add on to that?
No, I think your graph sort of reflects my experience in that actually the majority of our clients don't have a formal program. It's on an as needed basis. And often, yeah, after a financing, they'll look at the, who needs to be topped up, who's been diluted, who's important and needs to be kept on board. And that's when you see those sort of top-up grants occurring.
I know we're nearing the end. We do have other topics that we could have discussed, but I'm going to actually put a pin in it here because I hate to run through something fast. We could have discussed sort of the accelerated vesting and the event of change of control and severance and carve out plans. Those are all things. Maybe we're going to have another webinar because going too fast over topics sort of leaves people with their head spinning. But maybe, Michael, I'm going to pass it to you as we're winding up here. Key takeaways. What's the the best advice you have for this audience that we've had today that you think is the most important thing?
I think if you're building a transatlantic business or even a European, UK, US business, I think you should expect complexity in this area. You need to allocate time to it to think it through. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of tax pieces. Don't leave it to the last minute. Like really spend time on this and get it right.
Yeah, Martin.
Yeah, I would say, just accept that there are differences between the jurisdictions. Trying to harmonize everything and keep everything the same for everybody will just lead you into trouble, because then you go off market very quickly and you're just storing up problems down the line.
Yeah, Claire.
I think I'm going to sound like I'm just repeating the previous points, but yeah, don't assume that because something works in the UK or the jurisdiction you're operating in Europe, it's going to work in the US. Take advice early and expect differences.
And data. My takeaway is data, and more data. There is great data, and participate, because your voice counts, and having this data, everything's anonymized. So there's no worry about having exposure, but it does help you make good decisions, and you can see there are decisions to make. So the link to the survey is just now put into the chat. We're going to send a recording out from today, and we thank you all for being here. If anyone has questions, please feel free to email us. We don't distribute the slides because there were so many of them, but if there's something in particular we can help with, we will send a follow-up email, and we're certainly glad to answer any questions. So we appreciate it. To the panel, thank you. Wilson, you've been a long partner. Danforth, great, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you across the pond one way or another, right?
Absolutely.